Okay, welcome to another episode of the Academy of Management Review Origin series. It's good to be back. It's good to be talking about the backstories of AMR papers, these exciting papers like this one that are still in press, that have been developed and evolved, but are still sort of finding their way into the world. And we get to hear the backstory of them. So today's paper is Emotions and Client Participation in Jurisdictional Contestation. The authors of this paper are Mathieu or Bouchard, Luciano, Barin, Cruz, and Steve Maguire. And we're going to engage in a conversation about the backstory to this paper, how it evolved, and what we might learn from what went into writing this paper. But before we get into talking about the paper, I just love for the three of you just to each introduce yourselves a little bit. Where are you at? And what's your research identity? How would you frame yourself as a scholar? Let's start off with you, Mathieu.
Thank you, Greg. First of all, I want to thank you for the three of us for having us. It's really a great thing for us to be here. Very excited to be here with the three of you. So Mathieu Bouchard, I'm just starting a position as assistant professor at the Telfer School of Management, University of Ottawa. So very excited about it. I did my PhD under the supervision of Luciano here. Steve was on my doctoral committee. Anne Langley as well was on my committee. And so I was very well surrounded. And I'm interested in professions, especially, what are professions about, and this whole notion of that professions are increasingly contested, the crisis of expertise. How is expertise established? How is it contested? And what does that mean for our societies and for our organizations? So that's been my focus.
Awesome. Well, congrats on having an AMR paper going into your first job. That's fantastic. Well done. Luciano, what about you? Give us a little bit of your background.
Thank you, Greg. It's nice to be with you today. So I'm a full professor at the Department of Management here at HEC Montreal. I'm also the Sustainability Transition Director at the school, and I'm also director for our Social Impact Center. So most of my work and my research is around those topics, sustainability and social impact. And I really try to connect and use organizational theory to understand and to analyze and to investigate grand challenges. So I have a particular focus on marginalized groups and how we can integrate them in different types of activities.
Awesome. Thank you. What about you, Steve?
Oh, well, first, thank you, Greg, for this opportunity. I'm Steve Maguire. I am the Deputy Dean for Research at the University of Sydney Business School at the University of Sydney in Australia. And I'm also a professor of strategy, innovation, and entrepreneurship. I've been at the University of Sydney for 5 years now, and my connection to this paper and to Mathieu and Luciano occurred when I was at McGill University in Montreal, Canada for 20 years. I study technological and institutional change driven by the emergence of new risks to health and the environment. And I think I'm best known for my work on institutional entrepreneurship and institutional change and the organizing of risk.
Thank you. Thanks. It's good to have the three of you here, and obviously three people who've been connected in the context of Montreal, but are now in different places. So it's good to connect in this environment. So the paper here, Emotions and Client Participation in Jurisdictional Contestation. Do you want to give us just a sense of what is this paper about? You've alluded to a few key words, professions, emotions, but give us a little bit of a deeper take of what is this paper about.
Okay, so the 1 minute elevator pitch. First, professions are increasingly contested by social movements. It's a phenomenon that's increasingly discussed as part of what is known as the crisis of expertise. And so there's a lot of attention about this crisis of expertise, and it's something that's very that's shaking our societies at the moment. Second, until recently, research has paid surprisingly little attention to the clients of professions. And third, researchers are increasingly interested in the social role of emotions. And so we bring these three themes together to theorize how clients participate in what we call episodes of jurisdictional contestation. Those happen when social movements contest a profession. And so we present a typology of 5 modes of client participation that show a variety of ways in which clients exposed to an episode of jurisdictional contestation become agentic actors in that episode. And finally, we focus on the role of emotions in leading clients to enact one or another of these modes of participation. So and very briefly, that's what the paper is about.
So taking a little bit of a step back from that or concretizing that a bit, can you give us a little bit of a sense of, you talk about this crisis, this sort of crisis of expertise or questioning of expertise in the professional setting. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of examples of where this is happening and who the clients might be in those settings? Because you're clearly invoking the notion that it's not only about the profession themselves, but the clients to that profession or the people who are being served by that profession and where that's happening, just to distill it down into practical examples of where people might have been exposed to or understood this happening in the past.
Yeah, so we've focused our examples on the healthcare setting, and there's plenty of examples in there. And those are all not all new. You know, there's been for a long time, since the 1960s, 70s, and even before, psychiatric patients who have been organizing and contesting, denouncing psychiatric practices as brutal, as inhumane, and trying to organize and mutual aid group alternative ways of responding to their needs and aspirations without having to ask professionals for help. And so that's one example. Another example, maybe Steve would like to talk about it, is the whole HIV/AIDS movement.
Yeah, Steve, so that's what I know you for, or is your work that you did around that. So maybe you can overlay sort of the notion of this paper in the context of HIV/AIDS and some of the sort of movement activity in that space.
Well, I have to say that writing this paper and this project, it was deeply personal for me. The struggle of mental health patients against the medical profession and medical research echoes prior struggles of HIV/AIDS patients, about which I've actually written and published extensively. Mathieu reminded me of a younger me when I met him. He was passionate, he was intelligent, and studying a social movement at the same time that he was participating in it, and theorizing emotions at the same time as he was witnessing them in others or experiencing them in themselves. And some professional systems can marginalize and reinforce the vulnerability of the very people they're ostensibly serving. And this, you know, has recurred a lot with the medical professions. Mental health patient, HIV/AIDS patients, feminist critiques of medical research and healthcare. And this recurring and troubling dynamic just needs to be countered and theorized. So
awesome. Well, thank you. So who are the readers or the target audience for this paper? Who are the scholarly communities who you hope and expect will pick it up, find it interesting, but then also even beyond the scholarly communities, who's the paper sort of speaking to in order to understand what's happening at a deeper level and in order to interpret it with more sort of rigor and nuance?
If you wish, I can jump on that, Mathieu, and then we can keep going.
Sure.
So, yes, of course, for us, from the beginning, we saw that we had something that we wanted to contribute to people who are interested in professions in general. And we had this take from social movements and emotions and how we could reconnect those things. So, of course, people that are interested in understanding how social movements, they mobilize, how they challenge eventually some professions. Those are folks that we really believe that they're going to have something that they're going to find interesting in our paper. And we try to connect that also with some elements of institutional theory. And if I go even beyond that, I think there is a nice discussion that starts to happen in organizational theory around the use of framing and reframing and how we connect that with the notion of emotions, how the use of framing can trigger some emotions and lead to action. And I think this is something that is particularly interesting in this kind of grand challenge we were studying here, but not only, because I believe that in several grand challenges, we see this kind of phenomenon in which we have social movements that come to challenge eventually what is going on. And I think the use of framing is something that we see all around, right? When we have a grand challenge, let's just take climate change and others. And so depending on how we frame things, we can trigger and start certain types of emotions that can block people or on the opposite, make them go into action. So even though this is not something that we enter into details in our paper, we believe that what we are theorizing there can eventually open avenues to reflect further on the use of that and that model on grand challenges in general.
Yeah,
I think
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the paper also connects different literatures that have developed in separate silos. You know, professions, studies of professions and studies of the social role of emotions in organizations have just begun connecting very recently. And so we bring these two literatures together in a way that is, I think, quite novel. And I think our work can be interesting for scholars of the social role of emotions because we bring in a different theory of emotions. That's not the institutional theory of emotion that has been developing quite a lot recently, but really we draw our theorizing of emotions from the social movement literature. And so when we went and looked for empirical examples to support our arguments in the social movement literature, we realized that there was a whole theory of emotions that was there waiting to be kind of assembled. A lot of insights into how emotions trigger people into actions, trigger the clients of professions into different ways of participating in what we call episodes of contestation.
So it struck me that some papers are written for a very narrow and specific audience, but I would argue that this paper, people from a diverse array of sort of scholarly domains will find it interesting. I think certainly social movements, scholars who study professions and professional associations, organizations, organizing, framing, emotions. And then I think it's a very interesting example of thinking about theorizing around two sides of an equation. And so, you really get into the fact that there are these different parties at play with different sort of motivations and desired outcomes, experiencing different emotions and utilizing different language. And so it's a multifaceted paper, and I think as a result has a multifaceted sort of audience for it. How did it get started? What's the genesis of this paper, and then what's the story of how it evolved?
Yeah, so this is a very phenomenon-driven paper, and that is probably why it draws from so many different literatures. Is that in the few years before And at the beginning of my PhD, I was heavily involved in mental health activism. And during that period, I experienced firsthand each of the modes of participation, each of the modes of client participation in jurisdictional contestation that we ended up theorizing in this paper. So I had this kind of intuitive sense of these different ways that clients can participate in the contestation of a profession or a professional system. But those were kind of insights that needed to be refined and theorized. So I started reading, basically every kind of literature that seemed relevant to make sense of those insights. And so I got heavily into the sociology of professions. And I was struck by the absence of clients from especially Andrew Abbott's system of professions. It's all about professions competing with each other, and clients appear to be, first of all, atomized, and second, kind of passive recipients of professional services, and they don't really play a role in his very influential model. And that, kept, I think, that was very influential in how the whole organizational literature on professions developed after Abbott. And so I drew on the sociology of professions. I read a lot of theoretical and empirical studies of social movements. I read a lot of other things, and I picked from here and there insights and tried to assemble those, eclectic insights drawn from a variety of different literatures to theorize those ideas, those instincts, that I had from firsthand experience.
So were you drawing primarily from your own experience and just trying to assemble these in a way that seemed coherent based on what you had experienced?
Yes, that's basically it. Yeah.
And at what stage did you take it to Luciano and say, I think I've got something interesting here? And he said, oh, we need some coherence. We need some.
Actually, this is where I wanted to jump in here, because I think what Mathieu is explaining is already step 1 or 2, but I want to go back, to step 0.
Yeah.
And I still remember when we had that very nice meeting in a bakery store in Montreal. And I just had my first baby at the time, so I couldn't come to the university. I just said, come close to home and we're going to discuss. And I remember that he was still struggling on, okay, what is going to be the main theoretical approach that I'm going to use for my dissertation and everything. And we started simply to talk and to discuss. And he was telling me his story, and what he wanted to theorize based on his experiential knowledge, what he had believed, through the years. And so all of a sudden we realized, listen, actually all the time you are talking about you and other peers that and their relation with those professions. So there's something here that is the patient or the client, I don't know how we're going to call it, but there is an angle here that seems interesting. We don't know yet how we're going to theorize on that and how we're going to put everything together. But in terms of phenomenon, it seems that this is what is interesting in this story. And then I think we go to step 1, which is what Mathieu just explained, going deeper into the literature and identifying that, yes, the current literature was not considering as much the role of those clients, right? And how they challenge those professions.
Yeah. And at what stage do you get involved, Steve?
Well, you mentioned that the paper was multifaceted and speaks to multiple audiences. And the final version of the paper represents fewer facets and fewer audiences that, as compared to the earlier versions of the paper, where Mathieu described it very accurately. He was it's phenomena driven, and he was reading widely and bringing together an incredibly impressive amount of insights But at the end of the day, concepts proliferated, and some of them overlapped, some of them arguably contradicted each other. So there was a lot of conceptual triage and purification and agreeing on a vocabulary. And I think where I added some value was simply saying, no, we can't use this concept. We only use these, I don't know, what, 6 or 8 concepts in the argument. Even though the other ones are very exciting. So
and I think
that's my recollection of, I don't know where we are in steps, but like steps 4 and 5 was lots of purification.
And I think that's a really important point to make, is that, you know, especially someone coming in who might have been exposed to the phenomenon, having lived it, experienced it, almost has too rich an experience to get to that level of abstraction that others can digest and appreciate and use from a theoretical standpoint. So coming up against someone else who's saying, no, we need to simplify this, we need to strip it down, we need to focus on what's core, and even though these other things, aspects might be interesting, part of making a theory salient and making it sing is pulling out certain things so that you can allow what's core to really stand out. At what stage, Mathieu, did you recognize this client perspective is something that can really help enrich the professions literature and what goes on when professions come under contestation? Was that early, and did you come up with framing it as clients early? And
so
then
this focus on clients came very early. You know, before the PhD, I had a career in investment management, and my master's degree was an MBA. So I had no training at all in research when I started the PhD. I was, you know, in the course in the beginning of my PhD, professor was talking about epistemology, and I had no idea what this word meant, you know. And so I had no training in research when I started the PhD. And so I started reading, you know, first I knew it was about professions and the clients of professions. And so one of the first things that I read was Abbott's System of Professions. And as I said, I was struck by the absence of clients. And my doctoral dissertation was took an ethnographic approach to mental health activism, and I studied 2 different social movements and mental health, mutual aid groups and peer support workers that represent 2 of the modes of client participation that we theorize in the paper. And you know, I saw very little of this. I saw that clients in this context organized and acted collectively, and they created their own organizations, and they were very agentic in finding ways to respond to their needs that are not the you know, the solutions that professionals are offering. And I saw very little of that in the existing literature. And so that insight came very early. I knew that was the focus that I wanted to bring. And then, you know, as we said, you know, I assembled these concepts that I took from everywhere, and the whole thing was a mess. It was a concept soup, you know, and my co-authors were extremely helpful in helping me sort this out and simplify and streamline the argument and get rid of a lot of things. And I had also to work on myself to let things go that I thought were really cool or really important, but that were not necessarily helping the make a clear and simple argument. And so I learned a lot. I learned a lot from my co-authors through that process on how to theorize, how to make a simple, neat argument, and conceptual clarity and parsimony and these principles to write a good theory paper. I think I learned a lot on that from my co-authors, so I'm very grateful to them for that.
So you get it to the point of at least feeling comfortable enough to submit it. You submit it. What was the sort of first round of reviews? What was the sentiment? What did you have to do to change it? How did it evolve as it went through the review process?
Yeah, so I'll give my brief perspective and hand the mic to my co-authors to hear from them. But the first time that I read the response from the associate editor, Patrick Hack. Well, first I was very excited to get an R&R at AMR. I'm sorry. Very excited to get an R&R, but also I was looking at everything that he and the three reviewers were asking and were finding problematic, and really my head was spinning. It was like, wow, it's impossible. We can't do everything they're asking for. It seems like a daunting task, and so that's where my co-authors I think could bring in their perspective.
Yeah, so maybe what I could add here is that from the first round, I think that there were two things that were challenged and which were quite important, in our reflection. And one was this very notion of client, and the other one was about the audiences. So if it was a more generic paper in management in general for all industries, or if we're really focusing on one specific industry. So how generalizable is what we are trying to do? And those two things, they were core actually to our reflection, because the notion of client was from the beginning what we thought it was the big difference we had. And so all of a sudden we were, challenged, okay, but what do you mean by client? Do you mean any kind of client? Is that the client of an accounting company? Is that the client of a law firm? Or it's a very specific type of client that eventually you even call it patient, for instance, or you call it something else, right? So we had, to be much more precise in defining and justifying why the use of the word client was the right one to what we wanted to do. And the other thing was that at a certain point, we realized that even though we were able to abstract and to say that, yes, we can extend what we are doing to other audiences, but to define better our boundary conditions, to define better what we want to do with this paper, it would be better that we focus really on the healthcare system. And this was kind of what we did. So I think those first rounds, they helped us in this reflection and to refine and to streamline and to go exactly to what we really wanted to theorize.
I mean, I think that's really interesting, because as a first-time reader, when I pick up the paper and read it, and I was distilling what it was about, to me, like the compelling aspect was, oh, this is the client perspective and clients being active and taking an active role in professions. And no one's ever really looked at this. So that's like, to me, the hook, the novel aspect, the interesting aspect, but it's also the aspect where you got quite a lot of your pushback. And I think that's a paradox that we often see in theory papers, is that the thing that's most novel and interesting and can almost carry the paper forward is also the thing where you're going to have to do the most work. Because it's novel and interesting, it's going to take panel beating, refining, clarifying. And so it can be both a blessing and a curse in a single thing. And to me, that's what I think the client perspective does in this whole exercise.
That's true.
Right.
That's true.
Yeah,
So,
I think the decision to draw empirical examples throughout the paper from medical professions, but then in the discussion note where other professions where these kinds of contestations, these kinds of emotion-laden struggles might play out, really helped to write the paper. I mean, we were advised, well, the advice was either use patience and stick to the medical, but then other reviewers were like, well, no, you've got to speak to all professions. And so I recall discussions about the boundary conditions and, okay, we need an inventory of where this might happen. Like, obviously it doesn't happen with the clients of real estate agents. Like it hasn't yet. I mean, conceptually it could in the future. But so, I mean, I think that exercise of getting an inventory of empirical examples, the medical ones are sprinkled throughout, and then the non-medical ones are in a discussion of the boundary conditions. That helped us to be confident that yeah, we are talking about professions and not just the medical profession, and we are talking about clients and not patients.
Yeah, I mean, I think you walked a very interesting sort of balancing act or tightrope in terms of that you hone in and you create this sort of boundary to have this continuous example of medical continuous medical examples throughout, but then in the discussion open it up. And that's an interesting strategic practice in writing a conceptual paper, because if you had been jumping around from lawyers to accountants to whoever in the paper, I think it would have just got unwieldy. But if you had called them patients all throughout, then it would have left the paper quite narrow. So I think great job on doing that.
The initial submission, we had examples of a variety of professional contexts beyond the medical, and we received pushback on that from the reviewers, saying, look, it seems that your examples in the medical context are the strongest ones, and that really is where we drew our inspirations. That's where we were stronger, you know. And so no one had asked us to focus on the medical domain, but we made that gamble that it was better to focus on this and try to open it up later to have more convincing empirical examples, and that appeared to have been a good gamble. Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about the strategic use of figures, and I guess it's sort of first a table and then figures, and the way they both speak to each other, interrelate, and sort of build up throughout the paper or tell a story throughout the paper. So I'd just love to know, you know, when did the sort of visual aspects of this theorizing come about, and how did you use them as you evolved the paper?
Yeah, I think you need to go for it, Mathieu. We spent so much time on figures and tables you cannot imagine. So, but really, we could have like a 1 hour and a half meeting just on one of those figures that you have there, just to make completely sure that we're expressing what we wanted. So, but maybe we're the one who struggled most, Mathieu.
Just for listeners' sake, I think there's 6 figures in the and each one's intricate, precise, fairly specific in terms of the story it's telling. And then I think there's one or two tables, but the tables are very sort of, I think, yeah, two tables, but very clear and central in terms of telling an overarching story. So just it's clear that work's gone into these. So tell us a little bit about doing that, Mathieu.
Yeah, so we spent a lot of time on the visuals, and I'm a very visual person. So if I want to get my head around some kind of idea, first thing I do is I try to draw it, to represent it visually. So it's this kind of the way that I think, and sometimes these drawings only make sense for me, you know. So there was a lot of work. To try to work with Luciano and Steve to work on these visuals to help distill the key insights of the paper. And also visuals are tricky because they kind of lay out the insights in a very bare way that opens you to criticism, you know. It's very difficult to, you know, to slip in things without explaining them explicitly when you have them expressed in visuals. And so I think the figures attracted the attention of the reviewers also, and were criticized by the reviewers who thought that they were not explicit enough, or that there was this black box in the middle of earlier iterations of our figures, forced us to rethink the figures. And by rethinking the figures, we had to rethink the argument, because what's in the figures has to be in the written arguments as well. And so there was, I think, a back and forth between the visual representation and the written representation of our ideas.
Yeah, I can add that there is a paradox with tables and figures. I think in both theoretical or conceptual and empirical papers, is that they are a clear target. The phrasing is stripped down right to its essence, and the arrows are clear. You know, they're connecting things. And I've written many papers where we may have produced 12 different tables and figures to write the paper. I find them a very good tool to ensuring that all the co-authors are on the same page, know the vocabulary and stick to that vocabulary. But ultimately, maybe only 4 or 5 might end up in the paper. But the others, I call them like internal tables and figures, just to help the writing team. Yeah, well, the tables that you see and the ones and the figures that you see and the ones that you don't see were very, very helpful in that process of purification, because the symmetry of phrasing on one side of the table or one side of the figure to the other side of the figure, the parallelism of the phrasing, the equal weight given to concepts in different parts of the figure or in different figures, all of that is not an accident. I mean, it's really the product of, as Luciano alluded to, hours and hours simply talking about the figure or the table.
Yeah, they're largely disciplining devices where they discipline the team to be explicit and clear on things, and force you to create that balance, get that phrasing right, strip out things that are unnecessary, and And I think that's evident in what you've done.
And
Pragmatically, quickly, did you develop them just in PowerPoint or or using some other kind of software to create these figures?
I drew them with PowerPoint. Well, first on with a paper and a pen.
Yeah.
Then in PowerPoints. But now I use a new tool a new tool that helps, that is better. I don't necessarily want to do advertising here, but there are better tools than PowerPoint to draw.
So just pragmatically for you, what works for you? What's the tool called?
The tool that I'm using is Canva.
Canva, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
There's a subscription. But for me, I think it's worth it because it's much easier to use to draw things than on PowerPoint, because it's really made for that. So it makes it much more easier, and so you don't spend your time trying to get the arrow at the right place, or you really spend your time drawing. And so that helps a lot. I wanted to add that I think drawings, figures, they're also an aesthetic device, because it forces you to have some kind of symmetry, and the figures, they need to be aesthetic. They need to look good, and there has to be some kind of balance, some kind of symmetry. It needs to make sense to the eye, and when it makes sense to the eye, then I think it helps the writing also flow better and be organized more precisely, and in a way that reads well, that is aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah, awesome. So how do you hope that this paper will impact sort of either theory, empirical research, or even practice and policy? Where's your desire to see the paper picked up and utilized in an impactful way? I'd just love to get each of your takes on where you hope it might be picked up or have an impact. It's still early days for the paper, but where do you envisage it potentially going?
Maybe I can start. So as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm quite interested in everything that touches marginalized groups and grand challenges. And I believe that taking this perspective of those groups when we try to tackle those grand challenges, and understanding that they have voice and they can contribute eventually what needs to be done, is something very important. So hopefully that it has also this indirect effect. So of course, healthcare and inequalities, this is one grand challenge that we're trying to tackle here, but hopefully it's going to inspire also others, to reflect more about, yes, we should consider the voice of those marginalized groups. Yeah, the way we frame eventually messages, the way things are framed can trigger some emotions, and this should be taken into consideration.
Awesome. Yeah, I think thinking about grand challenges through both the framing and sort of emotional lens is very useful, because certainly the two are interrelated and impactful on whether people are picking up and working with grand challenges, or sort of overlooking them. So that's great. What about you, Steve? Where would you like to see it having an impact?
From my perspective, I've written recently a lot about risk, and I think the notion of taking the experiential knowledge of risk subjects or risk bearers, actors that may have risks imposed upon them, or maybe exposed to potential harms that they haven't consented to, involuntary stakeholders, and taking their experiential knowledge seriously as a counterweight against the expertise that comes out of risk analysis and engineering and medicine. So that's, yeah, I mean, risk is not a concept in this paper, but I can see how someone writing about the organizing of risk could take the ideas from here and run with them.
Interesting, fascinating. I would have never gone in that direction, but as you say it, it resonates and makes sense. What about from your side, Mathieu?
Yeah, so I've been invited for a couple of years now, frequently to present a simpler version of this paper to high level managers, strategists, decision makers, policy makers of the healthcare system. And it makes a lot of sense for them. They find it interesting, and it creates it opens up a whole discussion about things that they experience, that they struggle with in their work, and that they often don't have a vocabulary for, that they don't have concepts for. And so I've been happily surprised to see how this paper resonates with practitioners, decision makers of the healthcare system. There's a lot, there's a whole ecosystem of patient groups for different types of health problems. There are a lot of social innovation. There's a whole ecosystem of social innovation that comes from the client ecosystem in the healthcare system. And now I'm starting to work also in education, primary education, with the homeschooling, unschooling movements. And you see that same kind of dynamics where parents who aren't happy with the public education system gather and form their alternative organizations and create their own services to respond to their own needs on the basis of their firsthand experience with problems that the professional system doesn't provide solutions that responds to their needs and aspirations. And so I think the paper can help guide policymakers, decision makers in various professional systems, and it can also help valorize and understand this ecosystem of social innovation that operates in the periphery of professional systems, and that is often ignored or misunderstood.
And I'm going to add in 2 or 3 things here that I think, I'm obviously directly in the AMR audience and how I think about AMR readers utilizing and finding value in this paper. Number one, in terms of an example of very good development of a typology. And we don't often see that, but systematic, coherent, theoretically sound, but also pragmatically useful. And so I think, we're always looking for a paper as an exemplar of this or of that. And I think this is an exemplar of a paper that develops a typology and then extends and uses that as a basis for further theorizing in a very powerful way. Secondly, going back to, the precision and the care you've taken in developing both the tables and the figures for people who want to get a sense of what does a useful table or figure look like, and then just general conceptual apparatus. I mean, I think that you develop a whole lot of new theoretical takes, just your mode of participation from escape to opposition to accommodation to acquiescence to stewardship. That's just in terms of, you could use that in multiple different areas and use the emotions and how you've parceled those out and balanced them off against each other in multiple different areas. So I think there's just conceptual nuggets here that can be used in other areas of theorizing that people will really value. And so, from an AMR reader's perspective, there's a lot, both in terms of it being an exemplar of certain types and styles of theorizing and providing conceptual apparatus that can be used elsewhere. So congratulations, well done on a great paper, and thank you for being willing to share the backstory to this paper with our audience. I know our AMR Origin listeners are going to value and appreciate this, and I hope they take the time to go and read the paper.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Greg, for having us. That was real pleasure, and it's a great opportunity for us to get the paper out there.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And the bulk of the credit goes to Mathieu, who's inspired this work and did most of the legwork, and is really an amazing scholar and has a great career ahead of him.
Yeah,
well,
congrats,
I think
Mathieu.
that was, I would like to balance that. I think that was really teamwork, and this paper wouldn't be published in AMR without my co-authors, that's for sure.
Yeah, but your passion is an asset here, and your rigor is also something that is fantastic. So congratulations, Mathieu.
Yeah, carry through the things you're passionate about, and don't be scared of getting pushback, having things cut out, and having to do the hard work of nailing ideas down. So thank you for those lessons.